if you have any friends or coworkers or other VMware folks that you want to share this with, we're going to be recording this presentation. It'll be up on our 27 Virtual website under events, and then you can share that link out to other folks as well. And we'll be sending you the link to the presentation once it is completed as well. So please feel free to share this with whoever is out there. We greatly appreciate it. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and get started. And again, if you guys have any questions, just put them in the chat. So thanks for joining. My name is William Grismore, and we have DJ with us as well. Chris is kind of absent today, but if he is able to hop in, he'll definitely hop in and add some insight to it. So this presentation is based on 27 Virtual and our migration success stories. So I was a co-author of one of these Migrate to VMware NSX-T data center workbooks. We talked about some particular use cases in there as well. So feel free to check that out. It's a free download from the VMware website, and there's some pretty good information there with some very good details on migrating from V to T. So be sure to check that out. As one of the co-authors there. We're going to be discussing real-life migrations. Our first case study here that we're talking about on this one is about a larger customer. We've migrated a large number of firewall rules. So just a quick introduction. My name is William Grismore from 27 Virtual, and my primary role is lead architect, working with DJ on this project. And I will turn it over to DJ for a quick intro.
Absolutely. Hey guys, DJ Antonucci with Rest NSX. We are a software provider for VMware solutions and in partnership with 27 Virtual.
Great, thanks DJ. So Rest NSX was instrumental in this particular migration. So DJ's product is a great tool that helps us migrate firewall rules from V to T, along with some other really good features that we're going to talk about as we go through this. So it's a great product, it's a great tool that you can leverage during your migrations. So with any migration, the first thing we have to do is a pre-migration assessment. I'm not going to go through every one of these bullets, but you need to look at your physical compute resources. Is it on the hardware compatibility list? The main thing I would say is, the CPU configuration is important for the newer versions of vSphere. You need to make sure you have necessary hardware if you're going to be doing a lift and shift versus an in-place upgrade. And the version of vSphere is going to be really important. We're looking at, at this stage of the game, we really need everybody to be on vSphere 7, with 6.7 being dead in a few days as far as support goes generally. And the deprecation of the NVDS support is very important, that everybody first take their existing environment and move it up to 7 to make that migration go a little bit smoother, especially if it's going to be a lift and shift migration. The network is also very important. The network cards are important, maybe not as important maybe as it used to be with the converged VDS, but still a consideration. What are the physical network cards? How are they plumbed? What are the drivers? What are the MTU settings? Is there northbound? Where's your layer 3 boundary sit? Is it at the TOR or the core? Where does your SVI sit for plumbing certain things like BGP neighbors or TEP gateways, all that kind of good stuff that goes into planning the NSX-T networking portion of it. How is that all configured? It's really important to gather really good information about the customer's route switch environment, fully understand how that's implemented and designed. And we've had some cases where, switches were not aggregated and we had to throw a cable between them and configure the physical environment properly to meet particular designs. That does happen sometimes. So it's important to make sure we understand what that network infrastructure looks like. Probably one of the most important things we run into is MTU. If you're going to be doing overlay network in T, the MTU needs to be set, higher than the 1600 we had back in V. Storage, if vSAN is in use, that's good from a deployment standpoint, from an NSX management control plane standpoint. If it's an NSX-V workload domain, there can be some challenges there. Like you may have to evacuate the storage off to some other storage. Is there some other storage available that if I have an entire cluster that's vSAN and I want to go migrate that cluster to a new cluster, I might have to evacuate the workloads to some external storage, fiber channel, iSCSI. So when you're looking at storage, you're thinking about from where do I place NSX-T components, but I'm also thinking about it from where do my current workloads live And when I go to migrate, if I'm doing a lift and shift and not an in-place upgrade, how do I handle building that new cluster with that new vSAN configuration? So there's some pretty important prerequisites and things you need to think about before we even start migrating. I would say the number one thing right now is getting into vSphere 7 for sure. Make sure you know your network cards and your MTU. So one thing that can help us is do a manual assessment, right? Manual assessments are okay, but DJ, I think you have a tool that can help us with that.
Yeah, funny you should ask. So we have two solutions that we're going to be focused on here today. One is the MAT tool, which is on the screen here, so Migration Assistance Tool, which its sole purpose in life is to migrate using a lift and shift strategy from V to T, and we'll describe in detail here in a minute the differences between these approaches. But at its core, the lift and shift approach is, in my opinion, the least impactful to an environment, and it also allows you to be in parallel, have your T environment up in parallel to your V, so it's not an in-place upgrade. Obviously, there's other strategies out there, such as in-place upgrade with Migration Coordinator. So within the MAT tool, there's this assessment mode that will go out there and collect a lot of the information that Bill was discussing on that previous slide regarding versions, hosts, NSX inventory, everything that I'm going to show you here in a minute. But before we even get to that point, there may be some other assessment that you wish to do of the NSX-V environment that is irrespective of the migration to T, meaning let me analyze my existing DFW rules to see if they're actually in use, if the objects under them are still in use, and if I could clean them up at all. So a very large use case that we're going to talk about today is a large bank in Italy that had over, at the end of the day, 15,000 DFW rules, but started out a whole lot more before they went through this process. And with that said, Bill, I can jump into doing the object analysis here.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, do your thing, man. Take it away.
All right. Don't want to steal all your thunder here. All right,
No,
so I'm going to share my screen, and you guys should be seeing a login screen here for REST NSX. So the two products that we're going to be discussing here at a high level is REST NSX, which is a management platform tool, and then the other one is the MAT tool for migrations. So the first one we're going to be logging into here is REST NSX, and the reason I want to show you this is because of that use case we're talking about the 15,000 DFW rules at the end of the day. So let me give you a quick, 30,000 foot elevator pitch on what REST NSX is and what it does. So REST NSX is a management platform that combines three capabilities together. One is automation, the second one is operations, and the third is troubleshooting. So as it relates to NSX. So the first value prop that we really focus on here is that we are essentially a manager of managers. So under a single pane of glass, I have an AWS instance, I have a V instance, I have a T instance, and they're all managed as data sources here. And this is important, not necessarily from a V to T perspective, but just from a day-to-day operations of maybe I don't want to use Cross vCenter, maybe I don't want to use Federation, but I want them all managed together. So as you can see, I have NSX-V, I have an NSX-T, Verni, and even my AWS instance here managed in one place. So this allows me to do a lot of things that the tool can do for automation, operations, and troubleshooting. But one thing I'm going to focus on is what we call Object Analyzer. What Object Analyzer does is it looks at those firewall rule sets we're talking about. So let's use a real life use case here. Is that large bank in Italy that had at the start of the project over 20,000 DFW rules and tens of thousands of IP sets and security groups. And they had been up and running for a number of years, and they had great automation tools that would, when a new workload came on board, it would create DFW rules and objects. But the problem is once that workload disappeared or people moved on to new jobs, whatever it is, the DFW firewall rule essentially became a Swiss cheese, right? There's holes in it everywhere, and really there's no good way to audit it, if you will. And this kind of dovetails into some services that 27 Virtual offers around hygiene checks of your firewall rules and your environment. But one of the tools that they leverage is a REST NSX tool called Object Analyzer. So what Object Analyzer is going to do, it's going to look at the NSX-V environment, but it could do the same thing for NSX-T and tell me what rules, what objects are no longer in use. This is using historical data, meaning it's in my database, so it's much quicker for demo purposes. But you can imagine us reaching out to NSX-V API, getting all this data here. And in this environment, obviously this is a lab demo system. We can see that of the roughly 178 DFW rules, 156 of them are inactive. So what does this mean? So this means that a rule either has no hits on it, and you can specify a time frame. This was defaulted to ever, forever, or the rule is disabled. So just based on this two criteria, we can say these rules are not in use, or they're inactive or stale. So I can clean these up if I want to, but let's take it a step further and say, what about all the dependent objects, the IP sets, the security groups? Let me click on IP sets. So I have 198 IP sets, but 185 of them are inactive. Well, again, what does this mean? This means that they're either orphaned, meaning not referenced, they're not in a firewall rule, they're not in a security group, they're just a standalone object that someone created, or they're in a firewall rule or security group that is in use, but it's not active, meaning their parent item, which is a firewall rule, has no hits on it or it's disabled. So therefore, we can say the parent element is stale, but also the child elements are stale, in this example, IP sets. So in our use case, when we ran this tool, the environment was very large, so it took about 3 hours to run all this analytics going on here, downloaded all the data to CSV files and compared them to their Splunk reports and VROPs to ensure, yes, these firewall rules and objects are no longer in use. So what they ended up doing was delaying their V to T migration about 2 weeks so they could go through this cleanup effort. At the end of that cleanup effort, they went from roughly 20,000 DFW rules down to 15,000. And that's why Bill had an asterisk next to that, that number in his slide deck, because we brought it down there. So again, this could be done for V to T, clean up your V environment, and this could be edge firewall rules, but also after you move to NSX-T, you can run the same analysis against the NSX-T rule sets, maybe once all your workloads are moved over to T. So a lot of cool capabilities as it relates to preparing for the migration to T. One other one that I'll show you of many, many other is this reporting capability. So we have a lot of system reports on Box that allows you to see configuration data of NSX, whatever it is, but there's one here called runbooks, which is important because I'm about to show you a V to T assessment in our other platform, the map tool, but I can also run what we call these runbooks. Again, this is all based on my data source. It could be V, T, cloud, whatever it is. And let's say I want to just document what I have. I can click on a runbook because I collected it previously, downloaded it as Excel, Word, raw JSON, whatever it may be. But this is the exact configuration, a nice summary of information of everything that I have here. Then I can dive into all my individual objects that I have here, export it all. So I don't have to run things like a RV tools or my own custom scripts to run all these API calls. I have all my inventory right here. If you also notice that we flag these objects that says, oh, these IP sets are active, meaning back to Object Analyzer, these are actually in use. So we flag them in this report as well. So two very, very useful tools as it relates for V to T. There's many others, and I welcome you to check out our website and our YouTube channel about demos, but the essence of it is that anything you can do in the NSX UI and somewhat at the vCenter, you can use within our platform and a ton more. So with that, I'm going to now transition over and we're going to do assessment of our NSX-V environment in preparation for this V to T. So once I run the assessment, I'll turn it back over to Bill and we will continue on with some slides here. So now you should be seeing an RDP session of mine to one of my desktops. Oops, maximize that. Where I have my V environment, I have my T environment, and sitting in the middle here, I have REST NSX, the MAT tool, Migration Assistance Tool. And I'm going to log in here, and we're not going to do a migration yet, but we will. And I want to first use my right password and log into the application and highlight a few things of note. One is that our application supports what we call many-to-one migrations. And a many-to-one migration means I can take multiple V managers and migrate them to a single T manager. So I can take up to 12 V managers and collapse them into a single T manager. I have a utility customer on the West Coast of the US where we're taking 6 different V managers, collapsing them to a single T manager because the reason they did that in the V world was one for security reasons, because there really wasn't multi-tenancy and all that really good stuff that T has. And the other one was scale, right? T obviously scales a lot higher than V, so we can collapse these things together. So we support that. But the first thing I'm going to showcase here is that when you add in your data sources, your managers, your source and destination, you can run it in one of two modes. You can run it in migration mode, which is what we're going to do, or assessment mode, which will give us all this data. In migration mode, it's also all-encompassing and it has assessment capability, so I'm going to keep it in migration mode. And let me move some windows around here. We'll click on summary, and we're going to do a data collection. So what this is doing is going out to my vManagers, my vCenter, and grabbing a lot of that information that Bill was talking about. My versions, my inventory, whatever. It's not going down to the hardware level like Bill and his team would normally do in a formal assessment, but it's giving me a very good indication of what can and cannot be moved to NSX-T as it relates to all the NSX components. So in the top left corner here, you're going to notice there's green check marks, orange, and red. And this is very meaningful. So orange is something that T supports natively. I'm sorry, green is something T supports natively. Orange is something that it might support, and we'll get into those details. And then red is something that T doesn't support or our application doesn't support for a migration, which is very far and few between. You're going to see things like third-party guest introspection services. So if you're using PAN service insertion, we don't migrate over that because it's fundamentally different in NSX-T and so much easier to set up just manually. So there's just some things like that that we're not going to move over. And at the end of this collection, you're going to be presented with all the data on the screen, but you're also going to be presented with the assessment report. And the assessment report is everything you see here, but explanations on why things are marked orange, red, and green. Meaning, while this is collecting, let's go over to, sorry, my RDP session paused here, over to firewall. And let's look at this section called testing objects. So in this section, you're going to notice a lot of things that you could do in NSX-V, meaning you have VMs and firewall rules, you have clusters, data centers, DV port groups. The list goes on and on. There's about 12 different vCenter objects that you could have in a firewall rule in NSX-V. In NSX-T, you can only have a security group or an IP address in a firewall rule natively. And if you're going to use any other approach, scripted, migration coordinator, whatever it may be, it's going to flag these rules and say, Mr. Customer, you need to go change these rules in NSX-V to make them compatible with T before you proceed. We take a totally different approach, what we call intent-based. It says, we know what you mean. You want a VM as in the firewall rule source or a destination or a cluster. So we're going to create the equivalent object, which ties back to this whole notion of orange, red, and green. So anything in orange or red is something that we're going to migrate. We're not going to stop at any point and say, you need to go change something in V. We're going to highlight everything that says T doesn't support this, so we're going to create a subpart of it. So let's say there's a DFW rule that has an ICMP code in it that T doesn't support, that V did. Believe it or not, those do exist. We're still going to create the firewall rule. We're going to create the source and destination criteria. We're just going to flag that rule as you need to go look at the service criteria and define what you want to be because T doesn't have something equivalent. So we're not going to stop you in this migration. So we're going through there looking at our firewall rules, your logical switches, your DLRs, your ESGs, your load balancers, everything, and putting it in our database for this analysis. And in about 2 seconds here, we're going to get that new button that shows up. It says, show me this assessment report on here. There. So as soon as this finishes, you're going to see some new buttons pop up in the top right corner here, like that. Let me collapse some of these windows so I can showcase one other key capability. One is that we support selective migrations, meaning that we can say, you know what, we only want to migrate DFW rules, unselect network virtualization. We're not going to do the ESGs and DLRs. In the case of the customer we're talking about today, that large bank, that we actually did all of DFW, so we selected all this, and then under network virtualization, we came in here and unselected network virtualization, but we selected all logical switches because there was about 200 of them, and we want to create all the segments in T. So this is what we call selective migration, saying I want to include or exclude certain components within this. We're going to select everything for this migration. But that was a key component with this customer because they did a lift and shift using our technology and Bill's engineering team, and they pre-built the T environment from a route switch perspective and kind of tested the routing ahead of time before we actually did this migration. So copying over the segments alleviated them from having to create 200 segments, and they would just manually tie them to each tier 1 on the T side. So in terms of the assessment, let's download this assessment report. We'll do it in PDF version. And as you can imagine, this was, not a big environment at all, but it took, 2-3 minutes. That bank took about 2 hours to collect all this data, and really depends on the size of the environment. Most assessments are done within 30 to 45 minutes. And at the end of it, it's going to produce this PDF document with a table of contents and a summary of all the information here. Let me zoom in a little bit. We're going to focus on security, but we support the full stack here. And what this table is trying to show me is tell me what type of objects do I have in my environment. Do I have global and universal objects? We support both. Does not really matter to us, but it's good to know what we have. But then it gets really interesting around, let's say, security groups that have static members that are supported, like a virtual machine or an IP set. Or maybe it's a security group that has unsupported static members, like a cluster, a DB port group, some of the things I was showing you before. I want to know which ones are there, or how many of my security groups have regular expressions in them.
Hey, DJ, you have a question.
Yeah. Sure. Let me take a look at that. Apologize.
It's a friend from Brent.
Wondering about using this for a VCF3 to VCF4 migration. VCF3, it's possible. I need to stir my memory here. Bill may know. A VCF3 migration is T.
Yeah, it's a weird mix where you have like V in the management domain and T in the workload domain.
Right, and it's T. Is it 2.5 or 3.0? Do you remember?
The T was 2.5.1 or something like that, or was it 3.0?
Oh, okay,
3.0. 3.0.
Thanks. So yes, that could be done that way in terms of the NSX migration. But in terms of if it was an older, like say 2.5, we do not migrate non-policy objects to policy objects. I believe VMware recently just released a tool to do that for you. I think it's in Migration Coordinator or another tool. But yes, all right, let's see here. I had to pop back over, but you guys, Bill, just confirm you can see my screen again?
Yep, you're good. You're good.
Thanks for the question, Brent. Keep them coming. So as far as the security groups, how many have regular expressions? T doesn't support that. But let's go look at our DFW rules, right? Unsupported object. Let's say unsupported apply to. So maybe in my V world, I have an apply to of, a logical switch, right? In T, I can have an apply to of only a security group, but that logical switch or segment can be in that security group. But there has to be some sort of transformation that occurs. Another thing that we notice here are rules that require zero trust. This is a very important concept that we used at this large bank. This is specifically for those customers who need a longer migration window, meaning they're not moving all their workloads in a single weekend, let's say, or a change window. And so they're going to have some workloads on V, some workloads on T, and maybe they need to communicate. Maybe the domain controllers are back on V and the workloads are on T. So what Zero Trust does is it looks at your firewall rule set and says, how many of these firewall rules need temporary IP sets in them? And what a temporary IP set is going to achieve is that once I move this VM out of the V cluster, let's say user 1045, into T, this rule becomes changed, meaning it's no longer in this rule as a source because this vCenter doesn't see it anymore. So it essentially becomes an invalid rule, right? And that could affect permit traffic or deny traffic I wasn't expecting. So what we do is we detect which rules need these temporary IP sets and put them in there. So in this example, we're going to take these two VMs, grab their IP addresses, and put in a temporary IP set with both of those IPs in them. So no matter if that VM roams between V and T, it doesn't matter. This policy and the T policy are going to remain in effect on that one. And then the next logical question is, well, how do you clean those up? We'll show you that here in a minute. Very quick and easy process. So I'll keep this DFW open. and come back here to our assessment report, which is right here. And after that, it's the full inventory on here. So it gives you your hosts, your versions, also the status, right? OK, info, error. So if we look through here, and let's go look for error. Oops, if I could type. Here's an error because this is an app ID or layer 7 service that T doesn't support. So we're gonna flag it here. Let's see if here's one. Here's an empty IP set. We're marking it as error, but you can override it and we'll still build it. But the list goes on, and it's very important to understand that we're flagging these things before we even touch, this migration, right? This is just that pure assessment. Here's another example of error on security tags. There's no VMs attached to them. In T, for those of you who have maybe gone through the boot camp, understand that in T you have to have at least one VM attached to a security tag, or you can't create the security tag. So we flag this and say, oh, here's some security tags, but we can't migrate them to T because they aren't attached to anything along those lines. So pretty straightforward document, but it's a full inventory that I have ahead of time. So with that, I'm going to pause, turn it back over to Bill, and maybe answer some questions.
It's a great tool. I mean, I think that, anytime you can leverage a tool to migrate, my first thought there is, we all know what RV Tools is, which is good. That's a good checkbox. Now you got this assessment tool, and you got the capabilities of the tool to assist with the migration. And you're probably still going to do some type of manual look at everything, just to kind of get a feel for all the different components. There's a lot that goes into it. So yep. It's kind of a combination of all the above, so you don't miss anything and double check everything, dot the I's and cross the T's. One thing I want to mention here before we go any further, this slide was hidden on me. I didn't know it was hidden. But we're going to be giving away a gift card, 1 or 2 gift cards. All you need to do is stick around and complete the post-webinar survey form for a chance to win those. So please stick around, folks. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We want to make it as interactive as possible as we're going through. So DJ, I got a question about the tool though. Is there any limit, like sizing wise? Like, does your tool have any challenges? Like what would be an example of a size of an environment your tool could consume?
Yeah, great question. So we, with your team, I think put it through its paces on this large bank we're talking about. One of the largest migrations, I think, on record in terms of an automated approach. So this environment, like I said, was 15,000 DFW rules, tens of thousands IP set security groups, and that's really where I think we shined in the idea of it's a systematic approach, and it's automated in the sense of I'm not sitting there for hours doing things manually. I may be sitting there for hours watching the tool collect the information, do the migration, but I'm not sitting there collecting all the RV tools and all that kind of stuff. So I would say, our sweet spot as it relates to migrations, is probably 5,000 to 10,000 DFW rules, probably a few dozen ESGs, DLRs, a bunch of load balancers, along those lines. But we can definitely handle the larger ones out there. They just take a little bit more, as you said it earlier, you got to do some more manual inspection because, devil's in the details.
Great. I mean, the size of the scale is pretty amazing. So 15,000 firewall rules, we migrated the segments over. So we did kind of that custom selection migration. Your tool could also migrate all the networking over if we wanted to, isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea is that we give you the choice. So not only do we take that intent-based approach, we say, let's look at this from a holistic perspective and say, you know what, in T, some things are just fundamentally different. And maybe I want to redo my architecture, my routing architecture in T. So we will take the ESGs, the DLRs, the load balancers, the logical switches, all that as it's interconnected, and bring it over to NSX-T as a tier 0 with VRFs and tier 1s and either native load balancer or the advanced load balancer, your choice, and bring it over there. And you can also, during this migration, override certain settings and say, oh, maybe I want to disable this segment, or I want to not bring over this ESG DLR. But the idea is that I can pick and choose. And secondly, some customers, like this bank we're talking about today, decided with your team to pre-build the T environment, the tier 0s and tier 1s, because it was relatively complex. and they wanted to test out the routing, the failure scenarios, and everything before they moved over any of the firewall rules or workloads. So yes, it's a very good point that we can bring it all or bring part of it.
Right. So we can do this assessment. We can gather all the data. We can grab the standard RV tools data. We can kind of look at the environment, and we can make sure that we're ready for it by using all these different tools. The more tools, the better, in my opinion. And then it just makes sure that you're really prepared. You know, and for a lot of these larger customers, they need to be 100% certain that when they get to production, that the migrations are going to be successful. Nobody wants to be in the middle of a migration and have to roll back. But you know, I know your migration tool has a rollback feature. We'll talk about that also a little bit later on. We'll come back around to that in a minute, but we can also leverage the REST NSX mat tool to also roll things back if needed. But, you know, hopefully we're not doing a rollback, you know, if we don't have to. So the idea would be to use all these tools and make sure that we're good. Is there anything else you want to say on this particular slide?
No, just there really for your guys' reference for future when you refer back to here, just really our notion of this is just not a one button, one click migration effort, right? You're really looking at this as a systematic approach where look at V, look at T, maybe pre-build, migrate, then my workloads. But really this hits the nail on the head of maybe my V environment is not as clean as I thought it was. So.
Yeah, it's really important to make sure that the environment's clean. Now, when you go to migrate, things to think about just at a high level, like checkbox things would be, you know, what are they using in the V environment? Are they using only VXLAN? Are they doing only firewall? Or are they doing both? And then it gets fun if they're doing NSX-V load balancer or vRealize automation, where NSX-V is an endpoint and automation is spinning up workloads with VRA. And how does that affect things? Are they using the old VPN web-based SSL VPN that's been deprecated in T? And if they are, what's the solution to replace that? And then you got to make sure you get the right version of V. You got to be at least 644. We prefer to be on the latest version of V. Should be on 7 to solve that problem with the NVDS issue. The VXLAN port should be the 4789. Sometimes that may have not been changed correctly. There is a point in time where the port was different. We actually did a migration for a customer where we missed that, and we had to go back and adjust to that. So it's definitely something you want to be aware of. And it's part of the regular checklist. Even if you go to the VMware website for documentation on migration, that checking that VXLAN port is important to check that. And then using DJ's tool and doing an assessment to make sure the firewall rules are cleaned up. If you got firewall rules you're not using, get rid of them. And then determine how the rules are built. If you're lucky enough, if everything's IP sets, God bless you. That makes it definitely a lot easier. There's an interesting little note in that bullet on the bottom. It talks about a naked VM. When you migrate from V to T, in NSX-V, you can actually have a firewall rule with just a VM in it, like source or destination. You know, that's one of those little gotchas that's not supported in T. The DJ's tool will pull that out and notify you of that, right? And then to move that over, we got to put it in some type of a group on the T side in target. And then what is the apply to? If apply to is set to anything other than DFW, there is a particular step you have to go through to make sure that during the migration window, because you're not always migrating all the VMs at once, there's a particular thing that you have to do there to make that work. We'll talk about that in a minute. vSphere, no pending host reboots. Host must be connected to a virtual distributed switch. Believe it or not, some customers still have some standard switches out there. Compatible versions of T, we talked about that already. So I think that at this point in time, you know, you should be on 7. I mean, 6.7 update 3 at the very least. Upgrade the BDS to the most recent version also. So if you're upgrading your host, you got to remember that the virtual distributed switch version also needs to be elevated. Don't forget to do that. We've had customers say, oh, you know, I'm on the latest version. Then we go back and look at the switch and they never did the step where they upgrade the virtual distributed switch. So don't miss that. Again, 7. There's also this thing where you got to set the export version DFW filter to 1000. This is primarily if you're using the migration coordinator to migrate rules. When a session state is established to a VM, it kind of like marks it like as a version value. So it can be different in V than it is in T. And then if somebody's connected to the VM and in the source, and let's say during the migration, it moves over to the target, if that DFW filter version does not match, it can cause the session to drop and force the users connected to that VM to have to reconnect. So by making sure the export version is the same, in particular migration scenarios, specifically with the migration coordinator, when you're moving firewall rules, you just make sure it's set to 1,000, and that way you don't have to worry about it, whatever the case may be. Be careful about having DRS in automatic mode. You know, you're moving VMs in the source. You don't want maybe things to move a certain way. So you might want to consider putting DRS in manual mode in vSphere. Now T, like DJ talked about, you could in T have the design completed and you're just moving firewall rules, or have T completed and deployed and moving just the networks, whatever combination you want to do. We find as a partner that in a lot of cases, you know, we do the deployment of the network stuff first if it's there, and then we migrate the firewall rules and all the other stuff, right? But it can definitely be done either way. So make sure the design is complete in most cases for lift and shift. You know, if it's an in-place upgrade, that's completely different. Most commonly, be migrating the NSX-V VXLAN to NSX-T overlay. Have the management edge cluster out there to put the NSX-T managers and edges in. Workloads in the compute clusters will be paired for T. So that just means that we're going to make sure that, you know, we have the proper configuration from a vSphere version perspective within that source cluster, bring them over to the T cluster so they're ready to go for support for the converged VDS versus the NVDS. And then build out your infrastructure, tier 0, tier 1, build up the BGP routing or OSPF, whatever it may be, maybe even static routes, and get it ready to go. Now you can also migrate using bridging. You can migrate using HCX, or you can do what I like to call the Big Bang, which we did recently for a customer just recently. We did a migration, we did a Big Bang where there was no HCX and there was no bridging. We just took everything over. We took an outage and just moved it. Now the outage wasn't that bad, but there is an outage. Most customers don't want any outage. So what are the migration methods? You can do an in-place upgrade. You're a smaller customer, you don't have any extra hardware. You can do an in-place upgrade. There are going to be particular prerequisites you need to meet. Typically, you can use the migration coordinator to do that in-place upgrade. The one that we find the most often is this lift and shift where we coexist. That means we're going to build a brand new cluster. We're going to have NSX-T already deployed in the target. We're going to kind of do this rinse and repeat where we take a host out of the old cluster. Very important why it should be vSphere 7. We're going to drop it into the new cluster and prep it. Now we're going to actually reboot the server also. The ESXi host, we're going to take it out. We're going to reboot it, clean out the bibs out of the actual hypervisor, get them out of memory, reboot the host, sometimes twice, bring it into the new target cluster, bring it back in, nice and clean, and configure it with NSX-T. You know, do the configure NSX option. So that's definitely a way to do it. Coexist is similar to a lift and shift, but it's a brand new clean target. Usually it's a VCF platform. Customers have a brand new, pristine, greenfield VCF environment. And what we'll end up doing is using HCX or bridge to migrate the workloads over into that brand new target. So there's many different ways to do it. The two on the right are the most common. Out of those two, the one we do the most is the one in the middle. It's kind of like, you know, the same vCenter. That'd be the main thing to point out. The one in the middle, the light blue coexist, we're using the same vCenter, building a new cluster. So it's coexisting by building a new cluster. The last one is there's a new target, like a new VCF platform, which means there's a brand new vCenter that we're going to be moving over to. So they're similar from the fact that the way we're moving stuff over, but they're different from a management plane perspective. So DJ, talk about this. I love this slide.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, in your V to T migration, journey, if you will, there's three approaches that you can take in this journey. And obviously the first one is really the manual approach. I'm going to point and click or script it myself and build, my NSX-T environment to mirror my NSX-V and then move my workloads over. As you can imagine, that's slow and there's a lot of deficiencies in that method. So I'm not going to focus too much there, other than there's a lot of obviously manual work there. Then comes in migration coordinator. It's it's hard to argue with free. If it works for you, great in your migration strategy. It's come a long way over the past year or two out there, but there's still some deficiencies that we fill the gaps on. One is, obviously requires NSX-T to be in place, and there's really no true assessment mode. So it's I'm not going to say rolling of the dice. It's more of the, let's get in there. It's going to do that analysis of my V environment, but it's not going to produce me a report. It says, here are the things. It's going to give me a bunch of errors. It says, go look at this, rerun it, and then I'll tell you what the next set of errors are. So really not a elegant approach in terms of assessments. In terms of the migrations, it does the job, right? I know of customers who have used it. I have known even 27 Virtual have used it. So they use the best tool for the job, right? And that's all we care about, is getting you guys to be onto NSX-T and off of V, obviously. So the last one is obviously our tool, Migration Assistance Tool. So we have a lot of green check marks, and as you're going to see throughout the demo, we have earned these check marks. So we've been at this for about 4 years in terms of the software automation marketplace, and the V2T tool for almost 3 years now. We've done over 186, I believe that's the current count, migrations with our partners like 27 Virtual. Remember, we are a software company, so we are not out there to try and earn your business for services. We don't want our partners to be engaged with you in the trenches, architect the right solution, and pick the right tool that works for this migration. So when we are doing this from a MAT perspective, we just call it MAT for short, is we try and automate everything as possible. So the idea is that the assessment to the migration is a point and click. It is a standalone tool, meaning that we do not require NSX-T to be installed to run the assessment. Obviously, we need T to be built, at least the cluster of the managers to be built for the migration. And it's also actionable reporting. What we mean by that is that within that assessment report, we're going to give you things you need to go look at if you want the behavior to be different during the migration. So that goes back to the intent-based approach of we know that T supports certain things, and we're going to transform your objects into what is compatible. And we'll refer back to those DFW rules I was showing you earlier multiple times here on there. And then obviously multi-NSX assessment. So we can point the MAT tool to multiple V managers, run multiple assessments at the same time. So we, under the same interface. I don't have to deploy a separate OVA for each one of those. So that's really a summary of the available methods. Use which one makes sense for you. And hopefully at the end of the day, we're part of your portfolio for this migration.
And there's another column there that's not shown, DJ, which is you can call DJ, and if you need something special done, there can be particular, not all the time, right? But there can be particular scenarios where, because DJ is a very agile owner of the product, if there's something special that needs to be done in certain use cases, maybe not all, but can you talk about that? Because you've done that for us several times.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a really good one is most recently is a mutual customer of ours is a state agency where they have AD-based firewall rules, right, integrated Active Directory. And our tool, as you saw in that assessment mode, we marked it as red because we don't migrate those because it's fundamentally different done in T. So what the request was please migrate the sections, migrate the objects, and migrate all the rules, but just leave the security groups empty on the far side, and we'll populate them with the correct Active Directory group because they're moving to a new Active Directory server with new hierarchy. So it was ugly, the mappings. So we said, sure, let's look at that. So within a week, we had the code finished, tested, and I believe it was in the last 2 weeks, Bill's team has done this migration for this customer. So that's one example of where it makes sense. We can develop custom code, very agile in that nature, but to Bill's point, it's not a free for all. We have to make sure it's going to be applicable to other customers and makes sense for this migration.
Yeah. So let's take a look at this one. I'm going to try not to go into too much detail here because I want DJ to do a couple of demos for us. But this customer was quite large. They had the 20,000 firewall rules. And the one thing that was kind of scary about it is they were building new rules daily. Like it just kept growing and growing and growing. So, we did the full assessment, used the tools. We determined the migration method. Now, this customer was kind of like DJ said, they're pretty complex. So we built the NSX-T route switch environment. They had a very unique stretch cluster across a metro data center. So it made the configuration of the networking quite interesting. Then everything was deployed and tested in a migration lab. So they had NSX-V. So what we had to do is stand up NSX-V again and take whatever was in the production V and move it over. And DJ is going to talk about that in a minute. Gather all the lessons learned from this test migration from the NSX-V to T lab test, and then take all of that, validate it multiple times, iterate through it, get it all down to a science, and then do the same thing in prod and non-prod. And we even had to create some of our own scripting to make that work. So it was deploy NSX-T in the target, use the migration tools to go from V to T. But again, everything was done in a test environment. So there was an extra step that we had to go through to move all 15,000 rules into an NSX-V simulated test environment because they didn't want to test migrating out of their current V production, as you can imagine. So the first thing we had to do is do the design and deploy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is pretty generic. This particular customer has some unique switching requirements from a physical standpoint. You'll notice if you look closely there, there's an extra switch here that forced the design to go from the preferred single NVDS design today to a 3 NVDS design, the way the uplinks were pinned out and the way we had to do some unique things within their environment. I guess the point is that from a 27 virtual perspective, if you're looking to do a V to T migration, we've done all sorts of very complex NSX-T route switch design, single site, multi-site, stretch clusters, doing edges across clusters. So if they're migrating from V to T and they need to get the NSX-T stuff done correctly, we've been through the ringer, multiple times with all different types of northbound switch configurations with MLAGs or lags or HSRP, you name it, we've seen it, and we can get it configured up and done correctly. So the first thing we had to do is clean the environment up, get rid of unused rules, anything that wasn't supported, get rid of it, and make sure we understood apply to. Now, apply to is kind of a hard thing to explain, but if in NSX-V, I'll spend a little bit of time on this one, in NSX-V, if you have anything other than DFW in the apply to, and you're going to do a lift and shift with the same vCenter and do a gradual migration in the target NSX-T environment. In NSX-V, they called it a section, and NSX-T is called policy. So there's like this policy level configuration, and you got to do a trick to make sure that if your firewall rules in V have a group with members in the apply to, when you go to migrate the VMs to the target, if you're going to do the same group with the apply to in the target, the problem is when you migrate, the group is not going to be populated until when it's all said and done, when you do the REST NSX post-migration task. So there's a little bit of a workaround where you create a group in T that has all the segments that the target VMs are going to land on. You put that group at the policy level and tell it to have the apply to override what's in the rule level. I could probably draw a picture of it, but I'm not going to go into that much detail, but it is an interesting little thing that you got to be aware of. So whenever you're doing a migration from V to T, if that apply to is anything other than DFW, and you're doing kind of a gradual migration of the workloads into the target, there's a special workaround to make sure that the apply to works if the source is only a group. So you can think about that one for a minute, but it's definitely something to be aware of. Which objects will be migrated? I don't know. It depends on the customer. In this particular case, we were migrating the VMs, we were migrating the firewall rules, and migrating the networking. Everything else was the same. Of course, we're going to have to flip the gateway at the end. We find as a partner, the most common thing is to pre-build the networking and migrate the firewall rules. And in some cases, they have a lot of networks. It's good to use the tool to do it or a script to migrate the network over. And when it comes to the gateway flip, we've actually created our own script that will flip the gateway. So when you go to migrate the VMs, you can only migrate so many VMs at a time based on vMotion limits. You can migrate the VMs over and get the VMs all over, get the whole segment over, and then our script will take the gateway from the NSX-V, DLR or UDLR, disconnect it, and plug in the segment to the T side, assuming there's a network migration involved, like a bridge, and then it'll flip that gateway over for you. So in this particular environment, we have a test environment that was built, and then we deployed REST NSX. DJ, you want to talk about this I want you to talk about the step where we brought over the rules from V to V, the V to V sync.
Absolutely. Can you see my screen again?
Absolutely, yep.
All right, so we are back in REST NSX, not the V to T tool. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of capabilities within REST NSX that we just, one, don't have the time to show you, and some are just irrelevant to the V to T migration. But one that is very important is what Bill is alluding to right now, which is the whole capability of copying NSX managers to each other, even though they're not connected. Maybe they're not cross vCenter, they're not federated, whatever it may be. In this case, we're talking about copying production V firewall rules and objects to the lab environment so we can do mock migrations. And that's using a tool that we call Policy Engine within REST NSX. So Policy Engine does a lot of things. One of them is the ability to copy DFW rules between environments that are not connected together. So I can add in a policy, and you can see I have different policy types, meaning maybe I want to synchronize security groups, IP sets. I can even reach into vCenter and grab vCenter tags and import them into NSX and apply them to VMs. Because as many of you know on the phone call, that a vCenter VM tag is not the same thing as an NSX security tag. They don't talk to each other. They have no idea about each other. So the idea is that our customers want to tag VMs in vCenter and have that replicate to NSX, and that's what this does. We also can do security tag assignments, some pretty cool stuff there. But the one that we're focused on right here is called DFW sections. So let's just create a new policy called 27 virtual, and it's an empty policy here. And if I expand it, there's nothing in here, but we notice it's of type DFW. What this means is that I can synchronize NSX managers together. So here's my source. I'll say this NSX-V manager, which is this guy, and I can pick all sections or just individual DFW sections and add them as a destination. You can see this arrow as an import to this guy, and select my other NSX manager. I don't have another V manager, so I can't select a destination, but this is how it was done. So I could say, when I push this button called force sync, or on a scheduled basis, I could say copy all the DFW sections and all the objects to the other environment. So what this did, because it was so large, over 15,000 rules and tens of thousands of objects, is it copied all the sections, all the rules, all the services, all the security groups, all the IP sets, et cetera, into the lab environment. So at the end of about a 20-hour window where the tool was doing this, once the user clicked go, they walked away, had dinner, and went out, whatever it was, came back, and at the end of it, their lab NSX-V manager looked just like the production V manager from a DFW perspective. So at that point, what we did was we started doing mock migrations, and with Bill's team, he's said, okay, let's build the T0s and tier 1s in this way in the lab for the T side, and then let's change this option in the mat tool and that option, and just try different things out to see how it's going to behave and see what the outcome is. So we did that. I can count at least 8 to 10 times, right? Because it was just different environment, different things going on within the different options. But again, imagine trying to build that from build it from scratch. But number two, more importantly, is just builds the confidence. So when we went to actually do this migration, I'm trying to remember the actual report at the end, which is the migration report. I believe there was only a handful of errors or warnings we had to go manually correct out of tens of thousands of objects. I'll take that percentage any day for that. So that V2V copying enables us to build that confidence and make it a successful migration. Back to you, Bill.
Back to me.
Yep.
Great. So that's pretty cool. So I hope everybody understands the benefit of that. So this large customer, they have 15,000 rules. We're using this special tool, which is awesome, REST NSX, to use this policy engine tool to take the 15,000 rules that are currently in the production V environment, very sensitive financial institution, bring it over to a test V. So we're doing a V2V, just to be clear, like the first phase was a V2V, and then build this test environment, get it all over. Make sure we understand how it works, work through all the details of it. We don't need to go into every single detail in here, and then get it get it tested, the migration all in a test environment, so we can work through all the details of it. So it's a really amazing thing that we're able to do. All these things though in the target, had to be prepped, so if we're going to migrate from V to T, we got to make sure hardware compatibility list, vSphere 7, I've already kind of beat you up on that one. Make sure I have the right hardware. There's also kind of the step where they need to understand how to swing hosts. So there's usually like a run book that you need to kind of build out. We've done it for several customers. We have like a template and then we just tweak it, like the exact steps, how to disconnect the host from the switch and bring it out, take it out of the cluster, reboot it, bring it into the new one and prep it. So there's usually a step-by-step guide. A lot of times our customers will have like a dedicated VMware team. And what we'll do is we'll have that documented. We'll iterate through it in their environment specifically so we know exactly how to swing the host out from one to the other. And it's important because during the middle of the migration, when you're doing this lift and shift, you're not going to have enough resources in the target. In this example, the customer didn't go out and buy all new hardware. They were repurposing existing hardware. So we had to do this like shell game where, the rules get migrated, but as workloads get migrated, we have to, take a host out, remove it from V, reboot it, bring it into the new one, prep it for T, and then move some VMs. We have to go take another host out, reboot it, bring it in, prep it for T. And there are some detailed steps in there, and it could vary a little bit from customer to customer on exactly how to remove a host from one and add it to the other and prep it. So we make sure that we go through that process and document it. Then we can hand it off to their vSphere or VMware team. And then during the migration window in the middle of the night, when you're doing these migrations, they have a very, very prescriptive process on how to swing the host out from one to the other, because you're going to be moving VMs and migrating VMs and moving hosts, and you want to make sure that that goes as smooth as possible. You'd also want to try to provision as many of those up front that resources would let you do. And then you want to make sure that you're also validating the NSX-T route switch. You're moving things into the target. You don't want to move anything into that target until you've fully done all the validation testing, turning the edge off, turning managers off, turning back on, moving them around, turning a port off on the switch, all the kind of validation stuff you would do, you get that all out of the way. We would deploy and configure Rest NSX MAT, and we would leverage injecting IP sets. Now, DJ talked about that before, but when you're doing a gradual migration from one to the other, you're going to be in a situation where some VMs are on V and some VMs are on T, and we want to do that in a situation where there's a zero trust model. We've got to make sure that no matter where the VM sits, it can get access from source to destination. So when you migrate the workloads over, if you do everything by IP set injection, it allows you to migrate. And then once the VMs land in the target, there's a post-migration task that the MAT tool will do, assuming you're doing groups and tags. We'll have to assume that. That would be the goal in most cases, unless the customer just wants to stay IP set based. Once you get the VMs migrated over and tag them, and they show up in the groups and everything's done, then we don't have to worry about the IP sets anymore. But we leverage this zero trust IP set injection method, which is built into the MAT tool, to help us with that. The other good thing about it is that you're going to have these IP sets both in the source, in the V side, and in the T side, right? So you're injecting them. So when the rules get migrated, those IP sets come over. There's also a cleanup step at the very end that once everything's migrated over and all the VMs are properly tagged and in the right groups and we're sure everything's good, the very, very, very last step is this IP set injection that you did. Since MAT knows about it and can track it, it can also clean it up and remove it for you, which is very cool. This is just kind of a picture of a lift and shift migration. So we're injecting the IP sets in the source. We're using the Rest NSX Zero Trust option. And there's some advanced options on that, by the way, to how to exactly do it. Migrate all the firewall rules over. In this case, we also migrated the networks over. Again, the core route switch infrastructure is already in place, right? We inject those IP sets over into the NSX-V source, and then we have a bridge that's built. And you'll notice here that on the other side, that the gateway is red here on the right, and it's live here. That's just to get it set up. And then you prepare for the V to T migration by doing all your testing. Test all the networking, deploy the bridges, Now, bridges is an interesting concept. Bridges allow you to extend the network from V to T and migrate workloads over without having to take a big bang outage. So the bridging basically is a way to do a layer 2 extension between the old and the new, so you can migrate the VMs over. And the only thing you see is the regular ping drop like you would with a vMotion. When you do a migration in this picture, when you migrate across this bridge right here in the middle, when you do this migration with the bridge in place, you're going to get a normal vMotion ping drop. And when you flip the gateway, it'll take a few seconds, anywhere from 3, 10, 15, depends on the customer's environment with convergence, for the routing to converge. So one ping drop across here. Sometimes you don't even get a ping drop based on the performance of the network when you vMotion the VM across the bridge, and then a few ping drops when you flip the gateway. That's what we're talking about there with the bridge deployment. The bridge is a VM that lives on an NSX-V prepped host, and it leverages the TEP as the magic pixie dust to make the whole thing work to get across to the TEPs on the T side. So TEPs on the host on the T side, a TEP in the edge, but on a V prepped host. It's very cool stuff. So you deploy the bridges, and then you follow our bridging steps. We don't have time on this webinar to go into all the details, but bridging's fairly complex to get it set up. The one thing I would just say to everybody, if you're going to do bridging, you can leverage 27 virtual. We've done a whole bunch of them. The one thing I do recommend is to move the workloads across the bridge, and once you're done, turn the bridge off. You don't want to leave that bridge up and running. The way it handles ARPing across, it can be a little bit funky sometimes, especially as you're moving things. So we recommend you get it built, you test it, you move the workloads over, and when you're done, you shut it off. The rest of NSX policy engine to do the V to V sync, deploy all the workloads in that V environment and do the test. Matt's going to create the logical switches in the target. For this particular customer, Matt created the NSX-T segments on the target. We leveraged the REST NSX injection. It creates these temp EFF based groups that you can see in V. And then when you migrate the firewall rules over, you can see those in there. Could leverage Matt for rollback if we need to. We don't want to roll back. I like to say fail forward, but worst case scenario, there's a rollback feature in there. And then we would migrate the VMs over. A large number of rules can take a while. In this particular case, I know, Chris, you're joining the call. Chris is the engineer on the project. Chris, can you talk about how long it took to migrate the rules? Maybe he's probably not presenter. So maybe Deanna or Kelly can promote him to presenter. But I knew that it took some time. So imagine 15,000 firewall rules. So after we finished the policy engine sync from V to V, then we had to sync the rules from V to T. And this is just all in the test environment. So it took a while. Had to actually check back the next day to see, right? And then you need to perform the post-migration task with Matt. So you migrate the VMs over, and then the really cool thing about the REST NSX tool is it generates a summary report. You can see what happened in the migration. You can look into the log. You can look into the report, see where things failed. You can double check it. Some things you would expect to be missed. You can do a verification, and then you can actually start cleaning things up. Make sure the rules match from the source to the target. So there's some common sense things you want to do there after you do the migration.
I have the ability to talk now, Bill. So
yeah,
it did take, I think we noted here, it took about 20 hours to migrate the huge set of rules. So it sounds like a lot, but considering the scale, the scope of the rules, it's really impressive that it can not only handle that quickly, but not choke up on it. So micro-segmentation validation post-migration task is another thing that's helpful. It can show you section by section comparison, see how many rules have been brought over, give you some additional reassurance that everything was brought over as expected. And if not, you can look in to see what was missing.
And then we'd also validate the bridging, make sure everything's good. And then we start migrating test workloads. Again, this is just all being done in the test environment. We haven't even gotten to production yet. And then we flip the gateway to get the gateway over to the other side. And then post-migration task phase 2, this is where some of the magic sauce is inside of the Matt tool. It keeps track of the tags and the VM association. So when you migrate the VMs over to the target, it can associate those tags correctly and map those VMs to those security groups so they actually show up. Because if you think about it, you got a group in the target, you migrate the VM over, how does it know to join that group? Well, you can leverage the post-migration task to do that mapping. Chris, you want to talk about that just real quick?
I'm sorry, can you catch me up? I was making DJ a presenter. He was demoted somehow.
Okay. Yeah, I was just saying that, you know, what was the benefit of, so you have these VMs in V, you got T, you want to get away from using IP sets. You don't want to stay in IP sets forever. You want to use groups and tags. You built the groups in T, you migrate the VMs over. So how does that work? I migrate everything over, and then what has to happen to make it kind of like finish off the way you want the security to be so you don't have to live on IP sets?
Right, so Matt will store in its databases all the associations between tags and VMs, and it also associate any VM to group relationships. And what you can do is there are two separate post-migration tasks. One is to associate the tags to the VMs once they're on the NSX-T side, and the other one is to associate the VMs to the groups once they're on the T side. So you would handle both of those, and your groups would be populated, your VMs would be tagged, and your rules would be working using those tag-based groups rather than the temporary EFF groups, which probably have shown up a few times already on these slides, but
Yeah.
they won't be IP-based anymore, and you can remove those using a separate post-migration task once you have done all of your VM migrations.
So what is the concern from application owners during this migration where you got the, you know, you got the firewall rules, you got the networking. So what is that like? How does that kind of go down when you're working with the customer?
Typically, customers are concerned about keeping static memberships in place because they might reuse IPs, or they're worried that if a VM is taken down, that you'll continue to allow access to something based on the IP. So switching back to that dynamic criteria is preferable. And you want app owners to be able to verify that not only is the application working, but it's working based on the tag-based groups rather than the IP-based. So during a migration, you may want to run that post-migration task to remove those temporary IP-based groups, and then you know for sure it's not only working, but it's working using the real final state of having those tag or otherwise dynamic group memberships.
So keeping the application owners happy is pretty important.
Yes, yeah, you definitely want to have them available and make sure that they are smiling at the end, or at least begrudgingly, depending on the time of day. I mean, for this customer, I think we were doing it at like 2 a.m. their time. We probably weren't too excited about that, but at least they're happy to be done.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're going to migrate workloads across the bridge, so we got all the firewall rules over, everything's kind of built and you're doing the migration. One thing you have to do to get this working is globally change the MAC address on the distributed router on the target, like the T1 or T0 is a global change. The MAC address is the same as it is in V. It's got that if anybody's done a lot of NSX-V stuff, they know what that MAC address is. In order for this gateway flip to work due to ARP request confusion, you got to make sure the MAC address is different. So that's a global change. And then we have to also, you know, make sure that we enable forged transmits and MAC learning on the NSX-V side. And the bridge is deployed on an NSX-V host. It's an NSX-T edge on an NSX-V host, right? And then we can actually build the segment in the, we need to make sure that the segment on the NSX-T side is built with the same VNI number as in the source. So that way it's going to be cohesive, the same, not cause any confusion from a firewall rule perspective. And we do have a script that can do that. And also the REST NSX tool can do that as well. So you do all these things to kind of get everything in place. And then you're going to go through the step where you flip the gateway. So you start out like this, you migrate the workloads over to the target. Once the workloads are on the target in T and everything is good, we validated and tested, we need to swing the gateway over, because the firewall rules, the minute you move the VMs over, the firewall rules are going to be in effect, but they may not be routing out through the tier 0. So we need to flip the gateway. We have a script from 27 Virtual that'll flip that gateway for you and get it moved over. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to DJ And if you go through Matt and just show what that looks like from the Matt perspective.
All right, so we're back into the Matt tool on that collection phase, right? Which is, grabbing all the NSX-V data where we could exclude, include certain things, just do logical switches, whatever we want to do here. We looked at the assessment report, and let's look real quick, at the inventory. If we look at, for example, the DFW rules, here's all our sections and all the rules where we could be very granular. The next step of this process is what we call review transformations. And this is what we will do if you click the begin migration button. So it's essentially, it's a preview of what we're going to build in NSX-T before we actually do it. And on this page, there's a few things that we can do as overrides. And one of them I'd like to showcase here is what Bill was talking about around the applied to, right? He went into a great detail about being wary of the applied to based upon what we have. But within our application, we have all of our sections here, and you notice that we can do some overrides. So we can create a new section, in this example, Habib section A, where we say create new section, or we can apply it, add rules to an existing section. But we can also change the apply to something other than DFW. So if there's existing security groups in NSX-T that we pre-built, maybe with segments in them, we can, within the tool, change the apply to dynamically and say, instead of applying that policy to DFW, apply that policy to this security group that we built. So this will alleviate that concern of, VMs between V and T and, not being there as the group member. So we can do a lot of different overrides. As it relates to network virtualization, we can also do things of, tell what edge node to put it on. What exactly is the topology going to look like when we bring this over to NSX-T, right? We're going to build that tier 0 with the VRF and hang 2 tier 1s under it that were ESGs on the V side and create segments and attach them. So very similar topology as it was in V, just a little bit different. Instead of ESGs, DLRs, and logical switches, it's tier 0s, VRFs, tier 1s, and segments. But it's the same logical configuration on the T side. We can bring over the load balancers and everything we do. Before we click this begin migration though, let's say we want to run that zero trust mode, right? So at this point, we haven't done any of that temporary IP sets. So I can go back to my home page. You notice this new button showed up. They call it pre-migration zero trust. If I click on this, it shows me all my NSX-V sections that are eligible for the zero trust. So if we go back to DFW, here's that section called testing objects that have all those different things in it. And I believe I selected just zero trust for certain things, like I think a cluster and a security group with tagging in it. So, but we'll take a look here real quick. So I'm going to unselect all my sections just for the sake of time. And let's look at testing objects, right? This is our section. There's 2 rules in there that require it. Let's go create those temporary IP sets, back to NSX-V, refresh, and testing objects. Let's expand it here. You notice that I selected, here I have a cluster that has a few VMs in it, but I also created that temporary object that has the IPs of every VM in that cluster. Obviously not a very large environment, but we also selected it for security groups that have tagging criteria, because back to Chris's point earlier is if a VM leaves this environment and it's tag based, this rule no longer applies to that VM, right? Or maybe source and destination breaks. So every VM that is an effective member, this IP address 1111 was put in a temporary IP set with 1111 here. So regardless of if the VM lives here or not, this policy is going to be enforced, allow, reject, whatever it may be. So that's kind of zero trust in action on the V side. Now let's proceed with our migration. So I'm going to click resume, and it's going to bring us back to this transformation page, which is the recommendations of what we're going to build in NSX-T. Like I said, you can override things, review things, produce the same report like we did in collection. But for the sake of time, we're going to say begin migration. And we did a quick test to NSX-T to make sure that we can write and delete. And before I click this begin migration, let's go look at NSX-T. So this is my T manager. It's a 3.1 instance. And you notice it has some pre-existing things here. So we don't have to go to a greenfield. For example, I have 11 DFW policies here. None of these, look like we have on the other side, like testing objects, does not exist here. So we can go to a brownfield. We don't have to go to a greenfield. From a requirements perspective, we obviously need the NSX manager, the cluster stood up, right, the base managers. And depending upon what I want to migrate, if I'm doing network virtualization, I'm also going to need one or more edge nodes and a edge cluster. So in this example, I have a few edge nodes of different sizes, and I also have one edge cluster that they belong to. And this back on the other screen is where I could map them to these edge nodes if I wanted to. But by default, we'll just dynamically allocate them and place them in these locations. So we're going to create the tier 0s, tier 1s, all that kind of good stuff. Now, let's say begin migration. It's going to do a quick check, says, okay, I selected zero trust. If NSX-V, if I didn't do the pre-migration task, we would have done the temporary IP sets here, but it's letting me know that 69 rules in T are going to receive these. So let's proceed with zero trust. So that testing objects DFW rule will look exactly the same in T, meaning it's going to have a security group, and it's also going to have this temporary IP set, because that's what I just told it to do. So we're going systematically through each category of services, service groups, security groups, DFW rules, everything, creating the objects where we need to, and referring to ones where we also. So for example, if we find a service, let's just use an easy one, HTTP used in a firewall rule. We're going to look up in NSX-T, does HTTP already exist with the same port and protocol? If so, let's use it. We don't have to create something we don't have to. But if it doesn't exist, we are going to create it on that side. And it goes through. So now we're going through DFW, and let's see if our section here has been built yet. Expand this column. And we don't have our section we care about yet, called testing objects. It's advanced options. Just give it, oh, here it is, testing objects. You notice we appended NSX1 because that's what we told it to do, because if I'm coming from multiple V managers, I want to know where these objects came from, but that does not have to be there. That's a 100% option. But if you notice that we created some things here. So for example, where is the cluster? So we created a security group called NSX-V cluster, and we put VMs in it as static members because that's essentially what it was in NSX-V, right? The NSX-V cluster was just a container of VMs. So we put the same ones in here if they existed on the T side. All right, in this example, they existed in V and T because I have a stretch cluster between them. So that's why we're able to do that. If they didn't exist, it would be their IP addresses in here. And notice we also have the temporary IP set with the 4 IPs from the cluster, just like we had on the V side. So these rules are able to communicate between V and V or T and T regardless of where the VMs reside on that side. Let's go over to networking. I might be done. Oh, we're working on load balancers right now. We selected the integrated load balancer, so not the AVI or advanced on here. So we're not going to get that here. But as far as tier 0s, tier 1s, we built them all, right? So for example, we have our core tier 0. Then we had VRFs for each one of my ESGs. And under there, we have our load balancers. So if I click on topology, it's not going to be too meaningful to us other than if we go look over here, we're going to see that we brought over, added that VRF, auto connected it to the DLR ESG, right, that we brought over, added in services. Maybe they had NAT rules and edge firewall rules. We brought those over and attached the segments that were on the V side. So the logical switches made segments on the T side. So it's the same exact topology, except just using NSX-T terminology. So on this side, we are done. We could review it, which is that migration report Bill was talking about, or I can go back to the dashboard and you see a new button showed up here called post-migration task. These are all the things that we could not do during the migration, like Chris was talking about. We couldn't assign tags. We couldn't add VMs to security groups because they don't exist in the inventory yet. So as I move workloads over, I would come to this page and assign tags and groups to them. I can do it in bulk and filters and everything, whatever I want to do there. Now, for the sake of time and discussion here, let's assume for a minute that I came in, I assigned all my tags, all my security groups, my static members, whatever it is. all my workloads are on T. I've validated everything with my app owners. I've validated that the flows are working correctly. And now I want to remove those temporary IP sets because from my perspective, everything's over and I'm ready to go into full production mode. That's where we can do this post-migration task called Zero Trust Objects cleanup. So we give you the option to clean up NSX-V or NSX-T. Most customers don't clean up V, but I'm going to do it for sake of demo. I'm going to clean up the NSX-V IP sets. Then I'm going to kick off cleaning up all the NSX-T ones and let it work in the background. It's going to go through each rule and each object, but let's go back to NSX-V. Let's click refresh here. And testing objects, and our temporary IP sets are gone, right? It's just now the cluster, and it's just that security group with the tag on here. So V is kind of back to where it was. So this is somewhat, if I want to use this as a rollback methodology, I could, right? I just want to do a quick test, roll it back if I want to. Or if I actually do want to clean up V, I can along those lines. So on the T side, we are done. Let's go back over to NSX-T, go into DFW. And we're going to notice we still have our rules and sections. And let's go look at testing objects. You notice that I now just have that security group called NSX-V cluster and not the temporary IP sets. So it was cleaned up. So now I can truly test with my app owners that my tagging policy, my static inclusion, or whatever it may be is working as desired. And I can do this, like I said, I didn't have to select all my temporary IP sets to remove. I could have just done a filter that says only certain ones on here if I want to. So I don't have to do all my rules, whatever it is. So at this point, I'm either happy, right? Everything's working as expected, or what Bill mentioned earlier, which is maybe I'm not happy, right? Something didn't go right, right? We never want to be in that situation, but now we want to roll back. Or more likely is like what we encountered on that large bank migration, where in the lab we did, I think I remember the number was like 12 to 15 mock migrations in the lab. And each time we did so, you imagine we had thousands and thousands of objects in T, and now we wanted to go back and either change something in V or change a migration option within our tool, because there's lots of options I didn't even show you that exist on here. And so I don't have to clean up NSX-T at any point. We can roll it back. So let's do that. This is great for demos too. So we're going to go back and in reverse order, delete everything that we just built in NSX-T, but we're not going to delete stuff that was there. So we're not taking it back to factory default or removing anything that you have manually built over there. We're only rolling back what we did in this most recent migration. Because remember, we could take 12 V managers, put them to a single T manager, and I can roll back individual ones in that process here. So we're going through there. We're working on load balancers right now and probably tier 1s, tier 0s. And we'll let this proceed, but let's go over to DFW and we'll just, I'm sorry, wrong DFW. And we'll collapse this. We should start seeing DFW sections being deleted here shortly. But with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to Bill for the sake of time, and I'm just going to keep this screen going so you can see this cleaning up by itself.
Wow, that's a pretty amazing stuff to be able to see it go through, and do that migration, like that, and have it all automated in such a way just to make it go so seamlessly through. So all the tooling, everything you can use is great. You want to be able to use as many tools as you can to simplify the migration process. So let me just go back to here. So in our particular customer use case, we completed all the testing. We did the V2V sync, we did all the testing, and then we got everything ready for the production migration. And it's basically the same thing. I don't really need to spend a lot of time on this. We did apply lessons learned, but everything else is the same. Did upgrades to configurations to meet particular version levels, deployed NSX-T in the target, and then determined order migration waves, informed application owners, created a migration team, and then designed a rollback plan. So the rollback plan would also involve, the process that DJ just showed, and then the ability to flip the gateway back. So worst case scenario, we had a plan in place. Now, in this particular scenario, we did not have to roll back. Chris, correct me if I'm wrong on that. Did we ever roll back in this one?
For production, we did not.
For production, we did not. But there was a plan in place to roll back if it was absolutely necessary. You know, flip the gateway back, vMotion the VMs back, unprepare the host from T, and then prep them with V. Oh man, it's just a nightmare just thinking about it. But that plan was in place. And then the mat rollback that DJ just demonstrated. So then we created the logical switches in the target. So this is just a plan. We didn't do it. It was just a plan. Then we created the switches with Matt in the target versus using a manual method or some other script. We deployed the bridges and did all the testing of the bridges. We created the target DFW rule configuration with temporary allows in the target. Now that is something your security team would have to approve. Chris, in this case, did we do that? Did we enable allows in the target?
I believe we ended up doing that because of the consideration for the number of rules per host.
Yes, I think for smaller customers, we don't typically do that, but for this one we did. So during the migration window, temporarily put an allow. So there would be a window of time where the security would be loose, if you will, during the migration. Then we did the IPjet injection with the MAT tool. And then we scheduled a freeze, so no more rules will be added. Right? We don't want to have to, get involved in the middle of the migration window having rules show up. So that allows the rule migration to occur without having to manually create or duplicate rules in V and T on both sides, potentially. Rest NSX then did the final migration of the rules. Again, leverage match rollback if needed. And then perform the final migration. Again, 20 hours, just like it did in the test environment. And then we did rolling migrations, right? Initial migrations and waves of migrations. And then the post-migration, there'd be the initial post-migration, the summary report to make sure everything looked good, kind of like a spot check, if you will. A microsegmentation validation, where Matt compares the source V to T rules and section counts to make sure they're in alignment. And then the same thing for it's basically a rinse and repeat without spending too much time, right? And then there's the post-migration cleanup. So everything we did in test, we did in like a pre-prod environment and then finally in production, and then we do the final cleanup. Now, one thing about the post-migration, there could be a step there where based on the performance, they may need additional edge nodes. Maybe they have two, based on performance, maybe they need more. This particular customer had a limit of resources. So the number of edges could not be deployed initially. However, after the migration and more resources were available, then more edges could be added because they had a limited number of hosts to put edges on. Bridges were removed. One thing I said at the very, very least thing you want to do is when you get all the VMs migrated over, turn the bridge off, not necessarily remove it because you want to roll back. But when everything's all said and done, remove the bridges and then do the vCenter cluster cleanup. Rename clusters as needed. Sometimes cluster objects in T that you built may have a special name on them. You may want to rename them back to the original name. If you got any kind of automation tools or scripting that leverage the naming, create or assign resource pools and reservations, all the standard vSphere stuff that you would need to make sure matches in that new cluster maybe that you had before. VApps, reservations, affinity rules, all those kind of things. And then finally, remove NSX-V. So you give it time to burn in, and in the very, very end, the clouds part, the sun comes out, there's rainbows and butterflies. You can go remove NSX-V from that old environment. DJ, just a final wrap up from you on this.
Absolutely. So lots of assessments out there that we've done, as you can see, or hopefully saw, is that assessments is the easiest part of this whole process. Download, install our application, and click the button assessment, and you're off to the races. So get you a really good idea of what you have. A lot of customers don't even realize what they have. They think they have no VMs and firewall rules, or all their rules are supported by T, and that's most of the time not true. So very valuable effort is the assessment. And really the takeaway from a migration perspective is that we try to be the best tool for the job based upon the situation. So there are definitely situations where just If it's such a small environment, just build it yourself. Or if it's such a simple environment, use Migration Coordinator. But every one that we've run into across the board has been, there's this nuance or that nuance, and we need to account for it, and we don't want to change V. So our tool plus the 27 virtual engineering team, that combination, you can't beat it out there. So I work with a lot of partners, but I can tell you that this combination is tried and true.
That's great. I appreciate that. And the other thing I'll say on the other side is, to be fair to REST NSX, we didn't really scratch the surface here with the tool. There's a lot of other things you can do. I would recommend people that are watching this now or watching the recording, whatever the case may be, definitely reach out to 27 Virtual REST NSX. We'd love to schedule a demo. There's a lot more detail in there that we didn't even, like I said, we barely scratched the surface really. But there's a lot of things you can do with the tool from a migration standpoint, whether it's the assessment or the policy engine, if you want to do a V2V and do a full test, whatever the case may be. The details of how to do the migration and do the cleanup afterwards and the association of the groups and tags. It's just awesome tool set. With all the considerations in place, you get a good solution. It allows you as a customer to migrate from V to T successfully with little to no downtime, and then have it land on the target and be ready to rock and roll. And then when it's all over, it is a beautiful thing. I have to tell you, it can be a lot of work to get there, but once you finally get that migration done, it is a lot of fun to see that completed. So reach out to us, complete the post-migration, complete the post-webinar survey, and you'll have a chance to win one of those cars. There's not a lot of people here today, so you guys got good chances at winning, which is good.
Bill, it's
Yes.
Kelly. Let me interject. I'm going to be sending out that survey separately
Okay.
after we close the call, so don't expect it when you log off. If you don't receive it, can you please contact Bill or myself if you don't receive it within the next couple of hours? And I can be reached at kelly.nielsen@27virtual.com.
You put that in the chat.
I can do that.
Yeah, so put that in the chat while people are hanging on here for the last 3 minutes. And then I'd like to leave it open for any questions in the chat. I know that, is there a way to open this up so people can participate in the audio or no?
I think I can unmute everybody.
Yeah. Yep, so Kelly's got her email address there. She'll send that out. 27 Virtual is a partner. We can do initial assessments. We do assessments for free for customers. Definitely reach out to us, let us know. We can do NSX-T proof of concepts. We do a lot of things for customers, network assessments. Another thing that's important, we do participate in the VMware PSO credit transfer program. So if you're a VMware seller or you're a VMware customer and you've purchased credits, 27 Virtual can consume those credits to execute these migrations. So if you have a bucket of credit sitting there, we can leverage those from a monetary standpoint to help execute the actual migration. We can do a custom workshop for you. Anything like that you need, just reach out to us. There's my email address. You get Kelly's address there as well. And thank you for joining our webinar today. Thank you, DJ, for your awesome presentation as always. And Chris, thanks for your input on the project. Chris and DJ worked together for like 1.5 years on this project, so they did an outstanding job.
Thank you.
Any other questions from anybody? That wraps it up, and thank you very much, everybody. If you have any questions, there's my email address. You got Kelly's email address there. If it's something technical or from a sales motion, just shoot it over to me, and I'll be happy to forward it on to your proper representative. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.